This is part 104 of jQuery tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss how to create a cascading drop-down list using jQuery and ASP.NET. So here is what we want to achieve. On the web page right here, notice that we've got three drop-down lists: continent, country, and city. When the web form initially loads, only the continents drop-down list should be populated and enabled. Countries and cities drop-down list should be disabled, and they should not allow the user to make any selections from those two drop-down lists. Once I make a selection within the continent, at that point the country drop-down list should be enabled, and it should be populated with the countries that belong to the selected continent. The same logic applies to the city drop-down list. So let's see how to achieve this. The first step here is to create the required database tables to store continent, country, and city data. I've already done that, and here we have three tables: TBL continents, countries, and cities. So if you look at the continents table here, we've got the continent ID and the name of the continent. And here is the countries table. We have the country ID, country name, and the continent ID to which that country belonged to. So this continent ID is a foreign key referencing the ID column in TBL continents table. Similarly, we have the cities table. So city ID, city name, and the country ID to which that city belonged to. So this country ID is a foreign key referencing the ID column in countries table. And here is the SQL script to create those tables and populate them with test data. I'll have this entire SQL script available on my blog. And another thing that I have done is created these three stored procedures. Look at the first stored procedure. It is sp get continent. So it's going to get all the continents from TBL continents table. So if we execute that, we get all the three continents. And we have the second stored procedure here, sp get countries by continent ID. So we give the stored procedure a continent ID, and this stored procedure is going to return ID name and continent ID from TBL countries, where continent ID equals at continent ID, whatever value we are passing. So for example, if we pass continent ID 2, then we should get all the countries belonging to that continent ID. So similarly, we have another stored procedure, sp get cities by country ID. You give it a country ID, and this stored procedure is going to return all the cities belonging to a given country ID. So for example, I pass country ID 5, and we get all the cities belonging to country ID 5. So that's it from the database side. Create the database tables and create those three stored procedures. Now let's flip to Visual Studio. So here I have an ASP.NET Web Application project. Within the web.config file, I have a connection string that points to our database. And the next thing that we want to do is add three classes. So let's add a first class, and let's name this continent. So this class is going to contain two properties. So the first property is going to be of type integer, and this is going to reference the ID of the continent, and this will remain an auto-implemented property. And the second property is going to be of type string, and this is going to represent the name of the continent. Okay. Now I'm actually going to copy these two properties because our country class also required these two properties. So let's add another class, and let's name this country.cs. And this class is also going to have country ID, country name, and we need another integer property, and that is going to be the continent to which that country belonged to. So the continent ID. And we need similar properties in the city class. So let's go ahead and add our city class. So we want to add a class, and this is going to be city.cs. And again, city class will have city ID, city name, and the country ID to which the city belonged to. The next step is to add a web service. So let's go ahead and add a web service. And let's name our web service data service. So first of all, we are going to write some ADO.NET code, and in the interest of time, I have already typed the required ADO.NET namespaces. So we need system.configuration, system.data, system.data.SQL client, and system.web.script.serialization. And we also want this web service to be called from the script, so I'm going to uncomment this attribute right here. And let's change the name of the function. First of all, this function is not going to return anything, so let's change the return type to void, and let's rename this function to getContinents. So this is going to return us all the continents. And within the function, we want to write ADO.NET code. It has got nothing to do with jQuery, so I have already typed that in the interest of time. And if you look at the code right here, it's straightforward. We are reading the connection string from web.config file. We are creating a list of continent object. We named it continents. And then we are creating a SQL connection object using the connection string that we read from the web.config file. And then we are creating a SQL command object, and using this command object we want to execute sp-get-continents stored procedure, which is going to return us all the continents. Okay, and since that is a stored procedure, we have to tell that to the command object, and we are opening the connection, executing the command. While we are looping through each row, we are creating a brand new continent object, populating its ID and name properties, and adding that continent object to the continents collection property that we have created here. And then we are passing that continents collection object to the serialize method of the JavaScript serialize class, which is going to serialize that object to a JSON array and write it to the current response stream. Okay, so pretty straightforward web method there. Now we need two more methods like this, that is to retrieve countries by continent ID and cities by country ID. So let's make a copy of that function, and I'm going to change the name of this one to get countries by continent ID, and to this we have to pass the continent ID and the same idea. This time the stored procedure that we want to execute is a different stored procedure, and that is sp-get countries by continent ID. And if you look at the stored procedure, it has got a parameter, so we need to create a SQL parameter object as well. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to create a SQL parameter object. Let's call this param equals new SQL parameter, and let's specify the parameter name. So parameter name equals, what's the name of the parameter? It's at continent ID. And where is the value for this parameter going to come from? It's going to come from the method parameter that we are going to pass to, right? So continent ID, so let's pass that here. That's it, we have the parameter object. We need to associate that with the command object using the parameters collection property. So command.parameters.add, and what is the parameter that we want to add? Param. Okay, and then we are opening the connection, executing the reader. And another important thing that we need to do here is, here we have a list of continent object, but that's not what we want. We want to return the list of countries belonging to a given continent. So this has to be list of country. So let's change the name of this variable to countries. Okay, and I want to change all instances of continents to countries. So I can actually press Control dot now, and I get, the prompt to rename the instances. So I'm going to select this, rename continents to countries. So list of countries equals new list of country. And then as we are looping through, what do we want to do? We don't want to create a continent object. Instead, we want to create a country object. So country equals new country, and let's change the name of the variable to country. Okay, and look at that red rectangle underneath Y. Now that means I can press Control dot now to get that prompt to change the name of that variable to, from continent to country in all the places. So that's going to flip the name for me automatically, so I don't have to type that manually. Alright, so we are populating the country ID, country name, and we have one more property, that is the continent to which the country belonged to. So country.continent ID equals, now the name of the column is also continent ID. Okay, so we have the country object, we populated its properties, added to the countries collection, and then we are passing that to the serialize method. Same idea. Now we need one more such method, so let's make one more copy of this function, and paste it right here. And let's change the name of this function to get cities by country ID. Okay, and what do we need to pass? We need to give it country ID. Okay, so very similar method. So here we need list of city objects, and we want a list of city here, and let's change the name of the variable to cities, and let's change all the instances. Okay, and this time the stored procedure that we want to call is a different one, and that is sp get cities by country ID. So let's pass that here, and again this is a stored procedure, and this stored procedure also has a parameter, and the name of the parameter is at country ID. So let's specify that here, and the value is going to come from the method parameter country ID. Okay, and we are adding that to the command object, opening the connection, executing the reader, and here what do we want to do? We want to create a city object. Okay, and we want a new city. Let's change the name of the variable to city and rename all the instances of that to city. Okay, and we're adding the city object here. The property is country ID, so city dot country ID equals the name of the column is country ID. So we are adding it to the cities collection, and we are passing that to the serialize method. So pretty straightforward. So at the moment within the web service we have got three methods that are going to give us continents data, country data, and cities data. Let's quickly test them to make sure they work as expected. So first, get continents. Look at that. When I click on that, we should get all the continents. Now let's go back and test the other methods. So we tested get continents. Let's test get countries by continent ID. So this function has a parameter. Let's pass a value. Let's pass 5, for example. I mean, we don't have 5 as the continent. Let's pass 2, and we get the continents, the countries that belong to continent ID 2. Finally, let's test get cities by country ID. So let's pass 4 as the city ID, country ID, and look at that, we get all the cities belonging to country ID 4. So our web service now is working as expected. Now let's flip to our web form. So on the web form right here, I already have got some HTML. Let me quickly run this and see what we have on the UI, and we will discuss the HTML. So we have got this literal text continent and a drop down list, similarly country, drop down list, city, and drop down list. And all this text and these drop down lists are actually present inside a table, and this table has got, as you can see here, 3 rows, and each row has got 2 TDs. So in the first TD we have the literal text, and the second TD we have the select element. And look at the IDs of the select elements: continents, countries, and cities. Okay, so that's the HTML. And at the moment, if you look at the width, it's the minimum because we have no data. Now let's actually set a common width for all the select elements. So what I'm going to do here is, within the head section, let's include a section for styles, and I'm going to specify the width for all the select elements. So let's set the width to 150 pixels. So let's save those changes and reload our page, and all of them have the same width. Now within our jQuery ready function, so what's the first thing that we want to do? So here we have 3 drop down lists, 3 select elements. Now I'm going to cache these elements in a variable, because we will be referring to them multiple times. There's no point in looking them up in the DOM every time. So let's cache them in a variable. So I'm going to call the first one continents DDL, and the ID of the continents DDL is continents. Similarly, let's find the countries and cities DDL. So countries DDL, and the ID of the countries element is countries, and for cities it is cities. Alright, so we have the select elements cached now. So what do we want to do? When the document initially loads, we actually want to load the continent data and populate the continents drop down list. So let's go ahead and issue an AJAX request. Okay, so we are going to make an AJAX request, and the URL that we want to call is our data service.asmx. So that's the name of the service. So let's copy that, data service.asmx, and inside that service we have got a function, and the name of the function is get continents. That's what we want to call. And if you look at that function, it doesn't have any parameters. That means we don't have to send any data to the server. We want to issue a post request, so the method is going to be post, and the data type that we are expecting from the server is JSON. When the request successfully completes, this is the callback function that is going to be called, and the data that we get back from the web service will be stored in this variable, and we can process it the way we want. So what do we want to do? We want to loop through each object that we get back and convert that to an option and add it to the continents drop-down list, right? So I'm going to use the jQuery each function. So $data.each, and let's specify a function here. So to this each function, we are going to pass the index of the element and the element itself. So what are we going to get back? We're going to get back the continent object, right? And notice this continent object has got ID, that is the continent ID, and name. So now what we want to do is, we already have this continents select element, so continents DDL drop down list dot, I'm going to use the append function here. And what do we want to append? We actually want to append an option element, right? So I want to append a self-closing option element. Okay, and what is the data for that going to be? So the data is going to be an object. So this object is going to have the value property. So that specifies the value for the option. The value is going to come from this item object. So as we are looping through each item, the continent object will be passed, and the continent object has got the ID. So we want that as the value for the select option. And what is the text we want? We want the item name, that is the name of the continent. Alright, so let's save our changes and run our web page. Now when the web page loads, look at that, we get all the continents. Now one thing that's missing here is, look at this, within the continent the first option is select continent. So we want that to be the first option. So what I'm going to do here is continents DDL dot append. Actually, let's make a copy of it to speed things up. So I'm going to use the append function again, outside of the each loop, and this time the first option, the value I want is -1, and text is going to be select continent. Okay, so let's save our changes and reload this page. Now look at that, we get select continent as the first option. And another thing that we need here is, within the country and city drop down list, we want select country, select city, and both of them should be disabled. So we want to do a similar thing with the countries and cities drop down list, right? So let's change the name here to countries DDL, and let's change this to cities DDL. And for countries, the prompt should say select country, and for cities it should say select city. And another thing that we want those drop down lists to be disabled. So cities countries DDL dot, I'm going to use the prop function, and the property that we want to set is disabled, and let's set it to true. And we want to do the same thing with the cities drop down list. Okay, so let's save our changes, reload this page, and look at this now. When the page initially loads, we have the continent data, country and city drop down lists are disabled. Whenever the selection in the drop down list changes, so for example if I select a continent, then we want the country drop down list to be enabled. We want to display all the countries belonging to that continent. But if I select continent, what should happen? We should empty the country drop down list, and we should have only select country, and that should be selected, and the drop down list should be disabled. Okay, so let's see how to achieve that. So we need to wire up change event with the continent drop down list. So let's go ahead and do that. So here we have our Ajax function, which is retrieving us the data for continents drop down list. So now I'm going to wire up change event with continents drop down list. So let's go ahead and handle that. So what do we want to do when the selection in the continents drop down list changes? Now first of all, we want to check the selected value. And how do we get the selected value? We can use $this dot val function. That's going to give us the selected value in from the continents drop down list. So if that is equal to -1, that means the user has selected the first option, that is select continent. So what do we want to do at that point? So if somebody selects select continent, let's say I select Europe and then I go back to select continent, what should we do? We should have both of them disabled, and the first option should be select country and select city respectively. So if they have, if we have populated any data within those drop down lists, we want to wipe that out, and we want to kind of add that one option, select country or select city, and then set that as the selected value and disable those selections, the elements. So first of all, I am going to find the countries DDL. I'm going to empty that. Okay, and what do we want to do? We want to empty the cities DDL as well. And for the countries and cities DDL, so let's actually copy these lines instead of typing them again. So we want select country and select city options to be added because we cleared all the options that we had in those two drop down lists, and we want to set them as the selected values. So countries DDL dot value, I'm going to select the first option as the selected value, and I'm going to do the same thing with cities DDL, and we want them to be disabled. So again, let's go ahead and copy the code from here. Okay, so that's what we want to do if the selected value is -1. Else, what do we want to do? We want to issue an Ajax request, retrieve the countries belonging to the given continent, and display them in the countries drop-down list. So we're going to make another Ajax request, and in the interest of time, I'm actually going to copy this code right here and paste it within our else block right here. Okay, so this time the URL that we want to call is a different one. So the function is going to be get countries by continent ID. So that's the function we want to call, and we still want to issue a post request, and this time that function expects some data to be passed, and that is continent ID. So let's go ahead and pass that data. So we're going to pass a JavaScript object. So the parameter name is continent ID, and to get the continent ID we can use this dot val. So that should return us the selected value, right? And the type of data that we're expecting back from the server is JSON if the request successfully completes. So we get the countries data. So when we get countries data, what do we want to do? We want to empty the countries DDL drop-down list. So let's go ahead and empty that. If there is already any existing data, we want to empty that. And we don't want to do anything to the continents drop-down list. I'm going to delete that line. And we want to append select country as the first option. Okay, now we'll come back to the cities drop-down list in just a bit. Let's delete that for now. And we don't want countries drop-down list to be disabled. So I'm going to change this to false because I made a selection in the continent. That means countries should be enabled and it should be populated with data. And again, just for the time being, let's get rid of this cities drop-down list. And now what we are looping through, we are looping through each object that we get back, and the same idea. To the countries drop-down list, we want to append the option, the ID of the country and the name of the country. Alright, so let's save these changes now and reload our web page. And look at this, when I select a continent, look at that, country drop down list is enabled and I see the countries belonging to the given continent. Similarly, if I select another continent, look at that, I have France. Now let's select South America. Look at that, it goes back to select country and we have Argentina, the countries belonging to South America. Alright, now we need to do the same thing for the country drop down list. So let's wire up change event handler. When the selection in the country drop down list changes, we want to populate the cities belonging to the given country in the cities drop down list. Okay, so what we want to do here is wire up change event handler with the cities countries drop down list. So let's make a copy of this, and I am actually going to change the name here. So this has to be countries drop down list. So when the selection in the country changes, and if the selected value within the countries drop down list, if it is -1, right, at that point what do we want to do? We don't want to do anything to the countries drop down list itself. We want to empty the cities drop down list, so we can get rid of this. Anything to do with countries, we don't want to do here. So we want to empty the cities drop down list. We want to append select city as the first option. We want that to be the first option to be selected, so the selected value should be -1, and we want the cities drop down list to be disabled because within the country drop down list they selected select country. Okay, on the other hand, if it is not -1, that means they have selected any of the countries, a valid country. At that point we want to issue an AJAX request, and we want to call a different method in our web service, and that method is get cities by country ID. So that's the one we want to call, and we will still want to issue a post request, and the data that we want to send to the server is country ID. So that's the name of the parameter, and we retrieve the value, the country ID, from the drop down list. We expect JSON data back, and we are getting data into this callback function. So what do we want to do at this point? We want to empty the cities drop down list, and to the cities drop down list we want to append select city as the first option, and we don't want cities drop down list to be disabled, so I'm going to set that to false, and we are going to loop through each object, and we want to append the options to the cities drop down list. Okay, alright, so let's go ahead, save our changes and reload our page. Look at that, I select a continent and I have all the countries belonging to that continent. So I select a country, and look at the cities drop down list. I have the cities belonging to the given country. Now if I go back and select country from the country drop down list, look at that, cities drop down list is disabled and it says select city. Similarly, if I go ahead and select continent from here, look at that, select country is disabled. The moment I select another country, continent, look at that, it's enabled, and I see the countries belonging to the selected continent. So I selected a country here, cities enabled. Now let's go ahead and change, for example, select continent to select continent. Look at that, everything falls back. Alright. Thank you for listening and have a great day.